Last week, we heard the story of Moses standing barefoot in front of the burning bush, and he was being given the job of rescuing the Israelites out of Egypt, where they were being oppressed and exploited as slaves. And when Moses expressed doubt about God's plans, the Lord gave him this reassurance. You remember this from last week. I will be with you. And then God offers Moses a sign so he would know for sure that God was behind the plan, that God was with him in all of this. And this will be a sign to you, God said, that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And that's exactly what happened. Moses rescued the Israelites, and they traveled to Horeb, where they gathered at the foot of Mount Sinai, where Moses had first encountered God in that burning bush, and they worshiped the Lord. That worship service was very different than our service this morning. At that service, everyone spent 3 days washing up and getting their best clothes ready to go to church. Everyone, they set up a rope up in front so that the people and the animals couldn't push too far forward. Can you imagine if we had to set up a rope so that people wouldn't push forward?
Amen.
There was thunder and lightning and smoke. It was like the worst summer storm and the 4th of July fireworks to get combined. The mountain was shaking like an earthquake, and all the while there was a trumpet band just blasting away. And at the end of the service, Moses was invited to go up the mountain to meet with God. And in the reading that you just heard from Deuteronomy, Moses spoke of that day. He recalled how he had served as a go-between for God and the people, braving that fiery mountain to receive God's message and present it to the people. The message was a gift from God, an expression of God's love. The gift was a guide on how to live life in a special relationship with God and with one another. That's the story that's told in Exodus 19 and 20. When Moses is speaking to the people here in this passage in Deuteronomy, it's actually 40 years later. And in fact, he is not talking to the people who were there at Horeb on that day at all. Rather, Moses is talking to their children and to their grandchildren who were born since that day at Mount Sinai, who had been born in the wilderness. And it's interesting because Moses says to them, the Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. He says it was not with your parents that the Lord made this covenant, but with all of us who are alive here today. The Lord spoke to you face to face out of the fire on the mountain. But since that was not technically true, why did Moses say that? As Moses was sharing those words, the people who are listening are gathered on the banks of the Jordan River. They are preparing to enter the land that God is giving them. For generations, they have not had land of their own. For generations, they've been told what to do. They've been under the thumb of slave drivers, slave masters, and a dictator working 7 days a week. They don't know what it's like to live as a free people, to make those decisions on their own. And now they're about to enter uncharted territory They're about to enter a land where there are people who have great differences from them. They're on the verge of this new kind of life, and they need a new way to live in that land, a new culture that would fit the new realities of the new day. For a while now, in our news reports today, I've heard that phrase, "This is not normal." It's not normal. Some of the language that's being used in the public forum, the animosity, the partisanship, the way of interacting with those who are not of the same nationality as we are, the disregard for ethics and truth. This last week, with the start of an impeachment inquiry, our nation is on the edge of what some commentators have called uncharted territory. Unprecedented. How do we live then in a time that's uncharted? How do we live with shifting power structures and shifting culture? How do we work and live with people with whom we have deep disagreements or with whom we have deep differences in language or culture or faith? We too need a guide that will show us how to live in a way that honors God in these times, that's life-giving to us and to others. We need the words and commands of Deuteronomy 5 and 6, just as those who are standing on the banks of the Jordan River or at the foot of Mount Sinai. Every generation needs to hear these words as if they're spoken directly to them in their time and their place. And then every generation can claim these directives as their own and enter anew into a relationship with God and with one another. That's what Moses is saying to the people that day, because he's also speaking to us in our day. Receive the gift. This day, these words are for all of us alive here today. We receive them as a lamp for our feet, as a light for our path. We receive these commands and rules and decrees, and we're to pass them down to the next generation, to neighbors and to friends. It's a gift for the flourishing of God's people, a gift rooted in relationship of love, the amazing love God first showed to us, and the love that God calls forth in us as a grateful response. Just like all rules and regulations and guides, there are do's and there are don'ts in God's command. The 10 Commandments are primarily the don'ts. Don't worship any other gods but the Lord God. Don't use God's name disrespectfully. Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't be unfaithful in marriage. Don't lie about your neighbor. Even the positively worded command of observe the Sabbath immediately adds don't work or make anyone else work on the seventh day of the week. And after these don'ts, God then gives the do's. And it's interesting to me that for some Christians, the list of don'ts has been more important than the do's. There are fights over keeping the 10 Commandments in public places, and these commandments are the subject of many a sermon in some churches. And yet for the Jews, it's the do's that take the greater place in their lives. The do's are the commandments that start in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, with the word hear. Hear this, Israel. The Lord your God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. The Jews call these verses the Shema, which is the Hebrew word for hear, how that passage begins. And practicing Jews would recite the Shema twice a day, following that directive in verse 7 where it says to talk about it when you lie down at night and when you get up in the morning. Many of these words are literally inscribed on their door frames, and some even place these words in small boxes and tie them onto their hands and strap them onto their foreheads, especially at times of prayer. The command to love God with heart and soul and strength was so familiar, so ingrained in the heart of a child of God, that when Jesus was asked which command of the law was the most important, he answered without hesitation. He said, "Hear this, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." And then Jesus extends the law for the love of God by adding a law for the love of neighbor. And this is the second most important, he said, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other command that ranks with these. The law of love for God and for neighbor is a perfect summary of the Ten Commandments. Those specific directives in the Ten Commandments show us that love that we're commanded to have for God and for one another is to be seen in our actions, in what we do or what we don't do. That love isn't just an emotion that we hold in our hearts. We are to love completely, with everything, with heart and soul and strength. What is it to love God with all your heart? For us today, the heart is a symbol of our emotions, of our feelings. But thousands of years ago, when Moses was delivering these commands, the heart was actually associated with one's thoughts, sort of what we think of as mind. Maybe that's why Jesus added the word mind in that. We're to think loving thoughts about God. We're to think loving thoughts about our neighbors and about others. We're to decide with our minds and our hearts that we will make loving God our first priority. What is it to love God with all your soul? There's been a tendency to think of our souls as something separate from our bodies, something that leaves the body and when we die and goes to heaven. However, in the Hebrew language and in the Judeo tradition, the soul is not separate, but it's completely integrated with the body. The soul is your whole self. It's what you care about, what you're passionate about. It's your personality. It's who you are. Loving God with all your soul is loving God with everything that you are. And what is it to love God with all your strength? When I hear the word strength, I think of my muscles and my ability to lift something or to open something. But the word for strength that's used here is much broader. It includes physical strength, yes, but it also includes the strength of all my resources, everything in my bank accounts and my cupboards and my garage. It includes the strength of all my influence, my social power. That's why loving God with all your strength involves giving and sharing. Being generous is a way of expressing love for God with all your strength. Each of those areas supports the other. The soul makes the commitment. Your thoughts direct your body. It requires strength to carry it out. the doing of it reinforces the feelings and the decisions so that the whole self is filled with love and is expressing that love. It's not love expressed just 1 hour a week in church. It's love that flows 24/7, 365. It's all day, every day, because it is who we are to be. It's to be our defining characteristic. Love for God defines us because love is God's defining characteristic, and we are to reflect, to be an image of our loving God. I saw this kind of love for God this week. Love for God and love for another, in perhaps the most unlikely place. In a courtroom, at the conclusion of a murder trial by someone grieving the injustice of a loved one lost. Amber Guyer was found guilty of murder in the death of Botham Jean in Dallas. And at the sentencing, the prosecution shared the extent of Amber's prejudice and anger and condescension from her texts and her social media posts. But then during the victim impact time, the younger brother of the man who was killed stood up and showed everyone the better way. Brant Jean is just 18 years old. He addressed Amber directly, and this is what he said to her. He said, "I know if you go to God and ask, He will forgive you. I love you just as I love everyone else, and I'm not going to hope that you rot and die. I want the best for you, because that is what Botham would want for you. Give your life to Christ," he said to Amber. "I think giving your life to Christ is the best thing Botham would want for you." And then young Brant put his words into actions, asking the judge for permission to give Amber a hug. And they embraced in the middle of the courtroom, and they were moved to tears. And the judge later said that in her 37 years in the court, she had never seen anything like that. She called it an extraordinary act of healing and forgiveness. This morning, I read a news report that one of the key witnesses in that trial was gunned down outside those same apartment buildings. The way of love is the better way, and yet there is still so much brokenness in the world, and it reminds me of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." That's the kind of love that God commands of us. And so in this difficult moment in our nation, uncertain of where we are headed, perhaps in a difficult moment in your own life personally, uncertain of where the future will lead, this is the word of the Lord for us. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Let's pray.